Hey everyone, today I'm going to show you how to handle errors in your React application. Now we're going to handle the error of the fetch API. So for example, if our server returns an error instead of the information that we need. Now what could be the cause of these errors? Well, for example, let's say if we forgot to turn on the server. So right now I'm going to shut down the JSON server, but I'm going to keep our React application running, and I'm going to go back and I'm going to refresh. Now it's gonna say it's loading, but as you can see, there are a bunch of errors that are being logged. Now, the cause for this is if we open the network tab, we can see that the to-do call has failed. And if you hover over it, you can see that the cause is a connection refused, which probably means that the server isn't running, or the server refuses to return a response. Now, if you go to the console, you can see this stuff in more detail, and you can see that it shows you in which line the error happened. So if we go to app.jsx line 22, you can see in line 22, we call the fetch API, which means that the error is being caused by the fetch API, by this fetch call. So how do we handle these errors? Now, as you can see, the fetch API has a .then method that is run when the fetch is successful or when the promise is resolved. And actually, when a promise has two possible states, it can either be resolved or it can be failed. Now, in order to handle this error, we have to use a different methods that is called the .catch. Now, .then is run when the fetch is successful, so when the promise is successful. But when the promise fails, we call a different callback that's called .catch. Now .catch, as the name implies, so it catches the error and stops it from breaking our application. So a simple way to show you how .catch actually works. Okay, so we have fetch and .then. So if this is successful, then we check if the response is okay, and if it's okay, we parse it to a JavaScript object and return it. And we wait for this promise to resolve, and then we console log the data and we set the to-dos. But what if the fetch isn't successful? Well, now the .catch actually allows us to control how the error is handled. Now, as you saw, by default, when an error happens, it's logged to the error tab of the console, right? It's not logged in the regular info tab, but in the error tab. Now, in order to control how that error is being handled, we use the .catch block, and the .catch actually gets the error in the callback function. And as you can see, it says unrejected, which means this .catch has a callback that's called when the promise is rejected, because a promise has two possible states: either it's fulfilled or it's rejected. Now, in our case, we're actually using console.error, but for now, I'm going to use console.log. I'm going to refresh. Now we still get the error in our error console, but you can ignore that for now. That's just the browser. But if we go back, you can see that the error is actually being logged as a regular console.log, because we're actually catching the error and we're controlling what we're going to do with it. And actually, the error has a special property that's called message. So if I type in error.message and I refresh, you can see that we get a simpler type of message. It says error fetching data failed to fetch. So this is the small text message instead of the entire error object being logged. So this is a much simpler form of the error. Now, what do we actually want to do with this error, right? So obviously, if something goes wrong with the application, we want to tell the user that something failed. So we should probably have some kind of state to store the error in, and then we show it to the user, just like we did with the isLoading state. Now to do this, it's very simple. As usual, we're going to use useState for this, and we're going to call it error. So it's very simple. And I'm going to give it a default value of null. Okay. Okay, now that we created a state for the error, we're actually going to set it. So I'm going to go back to our .catch block. So after we actually console log the error message, we actually want to set it. So I'm going to type set error and error.message. So now if the request fails, we're going to console log the error, and then we're going to set that error inside of our state. And what we're going to do with this error is actually we're going to show it to the user. So as I showed you in my previous video, we're going to do some conditional rendering here. So I'm going to open up the curly brackets, and if the error exists, then we're going to show it, and we're going to give it a color of red just to indicate that it's an error. Otherwise, we're going to return null, and null by default isn't rendered by React or JSX more specifically. So as you can see, now the error is shown, it's red. So if I refresh, there's nothing, but after a while, after the request fails, we get failed to fetch. And now if I turn on my JSON server again and go back to my app and refresh, you can see the error doesn't show up because the request is successful and we actually get the data that we need. Now I'm gonna turn off the JSON server again to do one more test, and I'm gonna refresh. Now as you see, even though the request failed, it still says loading. So we're not actually resetting the loading state when the request finishes. So in order to fix this, just like we have set loading to false in .then, we can also set loading to false in the .catch block. So if the request is successful, we set is loading to false, and if the request isn't successful, we also set is loading to false, because the loading state doesn't care whether the request is successful or not, as long as it finishes. And now if I go back and refresh, it says loading, but after a while, you see loading disappears and we get the actual error. Now, there is a much better way to do this. Now, as you can see, is loading is called in both cases. So a better way to do this is to use the .finally block. Now, .finally actually doesn't care whether the request is successful or not. It always runs. So if the request is successful, it's gonna run the finally block. And if the request isn't successful, it's also gonna run the finally block. So it's good to put logic that's being called in both cases. It's best to put that in the finally block. Now I'm gonna delete this. And now we don't have duplicate logic. We only set it in one place. And this will always guarantee that it's gonna run. And if I go back and refresh, I'm gonna wait a while, and you can see it's the same as before. Is loading set to false, and it doesn't show up anymore. And if I turn on the JSON server again, you can see that we're gonna get the same behavior when the loading is complete. You see, is loading doesn't show up anymore. So the .finally block is very nice because it guarantees that this code always runs, no matter what the promise state is, if it's resolved, if it's fulfilled or rejected. Okay. Now, one more case that we need to handle is that when the error isn't resolved, then we get the error and we set the state to the actual error message. But the problem is when we rerun the call, we don't actually clear the error. So if the next call is successful, we actually get the data and show it, but the error message will still be shown. So in order to fix this, we actually need to reset the error state when we start the call. So an easy way to do this is this way. So before we actually do the fetch, we're gonna set the error state to null. So this always guarantees that we reset the error before we do the next fetch, just to guarantee if the fetch is successful, then we don't get the old error. And if the fetch isn't successful, then we get the new error and we set it. So right now in this one single use effect, we do the fetch for the to-dos, we handle the success state and the failed state. And in both cases, we're gonna set the loading to false at the end. Now, one more use case that we can handle is, for example, if our database is empty. So if you don't have any to-dos, I'm gonna go back and refresh. Now you can see that nothing is being displayed, but the request is successful because we can see that it returns an empty array because we console log the result. But the thing is, the user may be confused. They think maybe something else happened because it's not showing. So what we can do is actually tell the user when there are no to-dos. So one way to do this is we're also going to use conditional rendering. So in this case, we're going to check the length of the to-dos. And if it's equal to 0, then we're going to say that there are no to-dos. So no to-dos found. No need for the red color because it's not an error. Now, by default, the to-dos is an empty array. So this means that we're going to show the no to-dos message while the request is still running. So if I go back and refresh, it's going to say no to-dos found. And then when the request is successful, it's also going to return an empty array. And if it's empty, we also check if it's empty and we show the no to-dos found. Now the cool thing is, if I go back to my database and I restore those to-dos, then I'm going to refresh my app. We don't get the no to-dos found, and we get the actual to-dos. Now one way to test this very quickly is I'm going to make some throttle and I'm going to refresh. So it says loading and says, okay, 1 sec, let me refresh this very quickly. So it's gonna say, so it says loading and no to-dos found, but after a while it finishes loading and the to-dos are actually shown. So this is one more use case that we have handled. When the to-dos array is empty, we actually tell the user that it's empty. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in my next video.